Throughout human history, wars have transformed kingdoms, destroyed civilizations, and left millions dead. Some conflicts were so devastating that their violence became part of humanity's darkest memory.
From ancient empires to modern nations, warfare repeatedly pushed human suffering to unimaginable levels.
But which wars deserve a place among the most brutal ever fought?
Our journey begins thousands of years ago, when powerful empires fought for survival and domination. One of the earliest examples was the brutal warfare of the ancient Near East. Empires such as Assyria became infamous for using terror as a weapon of conquest. Their campaigns combined military power, siege warfare, and deliberate psychological terror. Cities that resisted could face destruction, while conquered populations were often forcibly displaced.
Then came the rise of another legendary conqueror, Alexander the Great. His armies crossed continents, defeating powerful kingdoms from Greece to Persia and beyond. Behind the glory of conquest were enormous battles, sieges, destruction, and countless casualties. Centuries later, Rome would build one of history's greatest empires through relentless warfare. Rome fought wars across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Among Rome's most terrifying conflicts was the Third Punic War against Carthage. After years of rivalry, Rome finally surrounded the city and launched a devastating siege. The final assault turned Carthage into a battlefield of fire and destruction. The city's fall became a symbol of what total war could do to a civilization. But centuries later, an even larger wave of conquest would sweep across Eurasia. The Mongol Conquests created the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their armies were extraordinarily mobile, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective.
Cities that resisted could experience catastrophic destruction, while survivors faced displacement and immense suffering.
And the story was only beginning. The centuries ahead would bring wars on an even greater scale. As the Middle Ages continued, warfare became increasingly destructive as kingdoms competed for territory and power. One of the longest and most brutal conflicts was the 100 Years' War between England and France. Despite its name, the conflict lasted for more than a century, from the 14th to the 15th century. Battles, sieges, famine, disease, and raids devastated large parts of France. The battlefield itself could become a nightmare of arrows, cavalry charges, and close combat.
Yet medieval warfare was not limited to Europe.
Across the Middle East, religious and political struggles produced some of history's most famous wars. The Crusades brought armies from different regions together in prolonged campaigns over centuries. The struggle over Jerusalem became one of the defining episodes of medieval warfare.
But the age of empires was far from over.
In the 17th century, Europe entered one of its most devastating conflicts, the 30 Years' War.
What began as a religious and political struggle expanded into a massive European power conflict. Famine and disease often killed more people than the fighting itself.
Millions suffered across Central Europe before the conflict finally came to an end. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, transforming warfare into a truly continental phenomenon. Napoleon Bonaparte built an enormous military machine and challenged nearly every major European power. His campaigns produced enormous battles involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. One of the most famous confrontations occurred at Borodino during the invasion of Russia. The battle became one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic era. But Napoleon's greatest enemy was not only the Russian arm. It was the brutal Russian winter. The disastrous retreat shattered much of Napoleon's enormous army. Yet the deadliest wars in human history were still ahead. Industrialization would transform warfare from a battle between armies into a threat to entire populations. Soon, machines would make destruction faster, larger, and more devastating than ever before. And then, in 1914, Europe entered a conflict that would change the world forever. World War I introduced industrial warfare on a terrifying scale, turning entire regions into battlefields.
Millions of soldiers were sent into trenches where artillery, machine guns, and disease waited.
At the Battle of the Somme, the scale of human loss became almost unimaginable. The war continued for 4 devastating years, leaving millions dead and wounded. But the peace that followed did not prevent another catastrophe. Only 2 decades later, humanity entered an even larger conflict, World War II. World War II became the deadliest conflict in recorded human history. Unlike earlier wars, civilians were now deliberately placed at the center of massive destruction.
The invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the beginning of a war that would engulf continents.
Across Europe, armies advanced with tanks, aircraft, artillery, and mechanized forces.
The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the most brutal battles ever fought.
Months of fighting reduced much of the city to ruins.
On the Eastern Front, the war became a gigantic struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
Hundreds of thousands were killed, wounded, captured, or disappeared during the struggle. But the war's horror extended far beyond the battlefield. The Holocaust became one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Millions of Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Other persecuted groups were also imprisoned, deported, and murdered during the Nazi genocide.
Meanwhile, the war spread across Asia and the Pacific. China endured years of devastating warfare during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Across the Pacific, enormous naval and air battles determined the fate of entire nations. From Europe to Asia, civilians suffered as cities became targets of massive bombing campaigns.
Then, in August 1945, a new weapon changed warfare forever.
Atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing unprecedented destruction. World War II ended, but humanity had entered the nuclear age.
The world's most powerful nations now possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization itself.
Yet many of the next brutal wars would be fought without a formal declaration of world war. The Korean War divided a peninsula and became a deadly confrontation between global powers.
Millions died during the conflict before an armistice froze the division.
Then Vietnam became the center of another long and devastating war.
Years of combat brought enormous casualties and transformed the lives of millions. But Vietnam was only one part of a much larger story of 20th century conflict. Wars in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe continued to reshape borders and societies. Among the 20th century's most devastating conflicts was the Iran-Iraq War. For nearly 8 years, the two countries fought a brutal war with enormous human and economic costs. The conflict demonstrated how modern weapons could create years of suffering without producing a decisive victory. Then came the wars that followed the collapse of Yugoslavia. In the 1990s, ethnic and political violence devastated communities across the Balkans.
The Bosnian War revealed how quickly a modern society could collapse into siege, displacement, and mass violence. From ancient empires to modern battlefields, one lesson remains. War may change history, but its human cost